Who was really behind Julius Caesar on that fateful day? Why was Brutus chosen as the face of the murder, and who benefited from history remembering him this way? For 2 millennia, we have been taught to believe that Julius Caesar fell victim to a conspiracy led by Marcus Junius Brutus in March 44 BC. On the infamous Ides of March, Rome's dictator was treacherously stabbed in the hall of Pompey by those he trusted. But if we look closer, it becomes clear. This picture is too neat, too convenient for the victors. Historians of the past, such as Plutarch and Suetonius, described the events as though they were eyewitnesses. But the truth is that their accounts appeared decades after the assassination, which means they relied on sources already filtered through the interests of those who came to power after Caesar. What if the most famous page of ancient history was nothing more than a beautifully staged farce? What if Brutus was merely a scapegoat, and the true organizers of the assassination hid behind the shadow of his noble image? Centuries later, we begin to understand. Brutus may not have been the main culprit, but rather a victim of a complex political game. So who truly stood behind the murder? It could have been the man for whom removing Caesar was most beneficial, his own nephew and heir, Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. But more on that later. For now, it's important to understand how the legend was born, and why we were told this story, and not another. Why do all the sources of that time agree that Brutus was the main perpetrator of the murder? Who shaped the narrative after Caesar's death? History is written by the victors. This is an axiom. After Caesar's death, a new era began, and the new rulers could not afford chaos. To establish order, someone needed to be blamed. A villain figure was required, one who had betrayed the great leader. Thus, the image of Brutus as the noble traitor became the perfect candidate. But here's what's interesting. Why Brutus specifically? Among the conspirators were far more influential politicians and military commanders, yet none of them gained such historical fame. Even Marcus Junius Brutus, being a philosopher and politician, did not possess enough power to organize such a complex crime. Yet there are strange details in the records of the time. For example, on the day of the murder, in Pompey's hall were not only senators, but also other figures, personal guards of certain magnates, and even several members of the priestly caste. Why didn't any of them end up among the suspects? There is a theory that Brutus was placed at the forefront not because he was the leader of the conspiracy, but because he could be easily sacrificed. He was a convenient figure for legitimizing the new course of power. The shaping of Brutus' image, Caesar's chief killer, is the result of a subtle information war that unfolded immediately after the dictator's death. The authorities of the time needed a story that would explain what happened, evoke sympathy for Caesar, and alienate people from the idea of rebelling against the new rulers. This story had to be simple, understandable, and emotional. Brutus, the close friend of Caesar, the man he trusted, was the ideal symbol of betrayal. Hence, his name became the central figure in the legend, although the real events may have developed quite differently. Why didn't Brutus defend himself? Why didn't he deny the accusations if he was innocent? Let's suppose, just for a moment, Brutus was indeed not the main organizer of the murder. Let's assume he became part of a larger game into which he was drawn. Then comes the logical question: why didn't he try to defend himself, or at least refute the allegations of his involvement in the plot? Historians claim that, after the murder, Brutus and the other senators tried to justify their actions before the public. They spoke on the forum, talked about saving the republic, but the crowd's reaction was not what they expected. The people mourned Caesar, his reforms, generosity, and popularity among ordinary citizens made him almost legendary. Then Brutus fled Rome, first to Greece, then to Macedonia. He gathered an army, trying to continue the fight against those who came to power after Caesar, Mark Antony and Octavian. But here's the interesting thing. Never during that time did he openly declare that his name was being used incorrectly. Not a single letter or speech of his contained a direct denial of his role as the organizer of the murder, perhaps because he understood too much effort had already gone into the image of traitorous Brutus. Maybe he consciously took on this burden for a greater plan, Or perhaps he was simply used as a cover for the real players. Brutus might have known more than he ever said. Perhaps he understood that his name would become a symbol, not the cause. Perhaps he accepted this role to save others or to protect secrets that could destroy not just one person, but the entire power system of the time. But if so, then we must ask a new question. Who exactly placed him on this throne of betrayal? Who gave him the order to remain silent? Who controlled the flow of information after Caesar's assassination? And why was this version the one that reached us? After Julius Caesar's death, a real information war began. Who would throw the first stone at Brutus? Who would be the first to tell the people who really killed their beloved leader? In this sense, the winner was not the one with more legions, but the one with the better rhetoricians and scribes. Octavian, the future Augustus, was still a young man when his uncle fell to the daggers, but it was he who inherited not only power, but also the image. He understood. To come to power, it wasn't enough to simply destroy opponents. You had to create a story that would make that destruction legitimate. For this, he needed a villain. That villain was Brutus, the image of the noble traitor who betrayed the trust of a great general, a perfect tragedy plot that could be repeated again and again. But if we look at the sources of that time, it becomes clear. Many of them were written decades after the events, relying on chronicles that could have been subjected to censorship or even forgery. What if those very documents we accept as fact were created specifically to guide our perception in the desired direction? What if Brutus became the symbol not because he was guilty, but because it was more convenient for those who rule afterward? The information about Caesar's death was carefully edited. The version we know today is not objective. It is the result of a political strategy aimed at legitimizing the new order. Brutus became part of this agenda, possibly without even realizing the depth of the game he was drawn into. If we had access to real recordings from that day, to the voices of ordinary people, to the personal letters of the participants, perhaps we would hear a completely different story. Perhaps the name of the real organizer of the murder will never be known. But one thing is clear. Brutus had nothing to do with it. Why didn't anyone try to expose the myth of Brutus earlier? And why has this topic remained taboo until today? If the version of Brutus' innocence and the involvement of other, more influential figures in Caesar's murder has grounds, then why hasn't any historian, any scholar over 2,000 years seriously raised this issue? The reason is that history is not only science, but also a tool of power. Each era chooses its heroes and villains as it sees fit. The image of Brutus as a traitor became part of the cultural code of the West. He appears in Shakespeare's tragedies, in Renaissance paintings, in textbooks on ancient history. That's why any attempts to revise this legend faced resistance. The academic community, accustomed to a certain interpretation of events, is not inclined toward radical change, especially when it concerns one of the most famous crimes in world history. But there's another side. Archival data that could overturn our understanding of these events is either lost or under strict control. Some of the ancient texts are kept in the Vatican archives, where access is limited even for professional historians. And yet, it is precisely there that the answers may lie. Perhaps in dusty scrolls are hidden the names of those who truly stood behind Caesar's murder. Perhaps there are letters preserved that directly speak of Octavian's role or other high-ranking individuals. The myth of Brutus as Caesar's murderer persisted for so long because it was convenient for those who wanted to build a new empire on the ruins of the old republic. Exposing it was dangerous politically and ideologically. But now, centuries later, we can allow ourselves to look at the events more objectively. And if we start asking the right questions, if we seek the truth not in the books of the victors, but in archives, artifacts, and the logic of political interests of that time, we may discover the name of the real killer, who financed Caesar's murder, who benefited so much from his death that they paid for it in gold. Julius Caesar was not just a military genius or charismatic politician, he was a reformer. During his reign, he carried out a series of decisive changes in the system of governance and wealth distribution. He limited the influence of powerful trade guilds, redistributed land in favor of the poorest classes, and cut back privileges of the old aristocratic families. These measures caused outrage among those who previously controlled Rome's economy. Many of the senators who allegedly participated in the murder were connected to major trading clans, bankers, and even foreign powers. But if you look deeper, it turns out that the financing of the conspiracy itself came not from the Senate, but from entirely different structures. Archive records from Alexandria, where Caesar spent significant time, contain mentions of strange money transfers made just a week before his death. These transfers were conducted through intermediaries registered under dummy persons, but their recipients were not senators, but certain secret advisors at the court of the Ptolemies. Interestingly, shortly after the murder, many of those who had indirect ties to these financial operations received high positions in the new government under Octavian. Caesar's murder was not just a political act. It was a well-organized financial operation planned and funded by a group of people whose interests directly collided with Caesar's reforms. Brutus and his accomplices could have been merely a facade, a cover for the true instigators. But who exactly stood behind this money? We'll discuss that next. Why did those who supposedly killed Caesar not gain power after his death? Who actually became the beneficiary of the crime? According to official history, the conspirators killed Caesar to save the Republic. But what did they get in return? Brutus and Cassius were forced to flee Rome. Many of their supporters died in subsequent wars. Meanwhile, Octavian, Caesar's young nephew who formerly belonged to no faction, gained everything. Interestingly, immediately after Caesar's death, he began active action. He declared himself the heir, started gathering an army, established control over the capital's financial flows, and most intriguingly, he first cleaned out those very senators who supposedly participated in the murder, as if wanting to cover his tracks. But if we look at the financial flows of that time, the picture becomes clearer. In the state treasury after the murder, more than 300 talents of gold disappeared, an enormous sum for that time. These funds should have gone to pay the legions, but instead they vanished without a trace. Their trail leads to one person. Octavian controlled access to the treasury in the days following the murder. Can this be called a coincidence? Possibly. But if there are too many coincidences, it's no longer chance, it's a script. Caesar's murder benefited those who could exploit the chaos after his death. And that person was not Brutus, not Cassius, and not even the entire Senate together. It was Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. He turned out to be the only one who gained real political and financial control after the events of March 44 BC, which gives every reason to believe that he was not just a witness, but one of the organizers of everything that happened. Why did the legions loyal to Caesar suddenly switch sides? Who bought them? Caesar was a commander whom his legions trusted unconditionally. He paid them from his own pocket, gifted them land, glory, and honor. But after his death, something strange happened. Many of these same legions began supporting Octavian, a young, inexperienced, yet surprisingly skilled manipulator of people. How could this happen? By all logic, they should have avenged their commander. Instead, they became tools of the new order. Why? The answer may lie in money. After Caesar's death, a race for access to the state treasury began in Rome. And who got control of it first? Octavian. And he used these funds not only for his own propaganda, but also to buy the loyalty of key military units. It is known that within months of Caesar's death, units that once swore allegiance to him began acting in the name of Octavian. Moreover, some commanders received land grants and high positions even before active combat operations against the conspirators began. This is not just a change of power, it's a well-planned operation. Someone prepared the ground for transferring the military structure under new leadership in advance. And that someone possessed colossal financial resources. The legions didn't simply betray their commander, they were pushed to do so. The system of material incentives, created even before Octavian officially came to power, allowed him to gain control over the army practically without a single shot fired. This indicates that the conspiracy against Caesar was not just political, but comprehensive, with the participation of financial, military, and informational resources. And if everything was prepared in advance, then the murder was not improvisation, it was part of a calculated strategy. Who else could benefit from Caesar's death besides Octavian? What forces were operating behind the scenes? We must not forget that Rome, at that time, was not just the capital of a republic, it was the center of a vast empire, where the interests of many nations, merchant guilds, foreign rulers, and even cultic alliances intersected. Many of these groups were dissatisfied with Caesar's policies. Caesar implemented reforms, but limited the influence of large trading houses, curtailed the privileges, priests, and reduced Rome's dependence on certain regional elites. He also tried to establish closer ties at the East, especially with Egypt, where he had personal relations with Cleopatra. This provoked waves of indignation among those who considered themselves the true guardians of Roman tradition: old aristocratic families, financial clans, conservative-minded legates, and even parts of the priestly caste. Interesting is the fact that after Caesar's murder, these groups temporarily gained influence, but it didn't last long. As soon as Octavian firmly established himself in power, he began gradually subjugating or eliminating them, which indicates that their role was temporary, just part of a larger plan. Caesar's murder benefited an entire circle of people whose interests clashed with his policies. Among them were traders, priests, soldiers, and even foreign forces. But none of these groups obtained long-term power. Only one person managed to unite all these flows into a single system: Octavian, which means either he had prearranged agreements with them, or he used their fears and ambitions to achieve his own goals. Perhaps he played on their fears and ambitions to eventually turn everything in his favor. Why do the trails lead not to Rome, but to Alexandria and the Far East? Who else could have been involved in the plot? Caesar was killed in Rome, but if we follow the money trail, it becomes clear. The funding of the conspiracy came not from the Senate, but from beyond Italy. Among the strangest details is a record in one of the lesser-known Egyptian papyri mentioning transfers to the name of a certain messenger without a name, who acted on behalf of a third party. These transfers were made through intermediaries in Delphi and Rhodes, and the sums were huge hens of talents of gold. Who could afford such expenses? Only those who controlled international trade in spices, oil, and even slaves. Large trading clans based in Alexandria and Antioch. Moreover, there is evidence of the sudden disappearance of one of Cleopatra's advisors few days before Caesar's murder. He was later found in Asia Minor under a different name, and according to local chronicles, it was he who delivered an important message to one of Octavian's lieutenants. Can this be considered proof? Not yet, but one thing is clear: the connection between Caesar's murder and the interests of forces outside Rome is too obvious to be accidental. Caesar's death was not just a Roman story, it was an international conspiracy involving not only senators and legions, but also influential trading structures and even foreign states. Brutus was just a facade. The real players were hiding beyond the empire's borders, and their interests aligned with those of one person: Octavian. To understand who really killed Caesar, we need to go beyond Rome, and then we will begin to see the true picture. Who delivered the fatal blow to Caesar, and why can no one say exactly who it was? According to classical sources, Julius Caesar fell from multiple wounds inflicted by several senators. But none of the ancient authors could accurately indicate who delivered the first or final strike. Moreover, in Plutarch's and Suetonius' descriptions, it is said that the dictator, seeing Brutus among the killers, uttered the famous phrase, "Et tu, Brute." However, in other versions, it is said that he did not utter a word at all. These discrepancies should raise suspicion. If all the participants were known, if everything was as we are told, the description should be uniform. But since there are contradictions, it means the story was edited. But the most interesting thing is in the records of a little-known historian, Quintus Fabius Maximus, who mentions a person absent from any official list of conspirators. Allegedly, this person was near Caesar in the assembly hall and acted not as a senator, but as a doctor. Yes, exactly, the doctor of Caesar, who was supposed to care for his health, had access to him at any moment. And if we suppose that the blow was not the first, but the most precise and deadly, It's possible that the real killer remained outside the field of historical vision. Caesar was not killed by a mere mob of senators. It was a planned act, in which each participant played their role. But who delivered the decisive blow remains a mystery. Perhaps it was someone no one suspected. Perhaps it was that very doctor who disappeared soon after the crime. Or maybe, more on that later, could a woman have been involved in Caesar's murder? And if so, what role did she play? When we think of Caesar's murder, images of men immediately come to mind. Senators, lieutenants, philosophers. Women were not given a central place in ancient politics. But what if one of them played a key role in organizing the entire conspiracy? It is known that Octavian was closely linked to his mother Asia, as well as his future wife Livia Drusilla. Livia came from the ancient and influential Claudian family. She was not just beautiful, but an extremely intelligent woman capable of intrigue. Later, as empress, she would become one of the most influential figures in the Roman Empire. But few know that even before Octavian came to power, Livia was involved in political games. In some lesser-known records of the time, her connection to priestly circles and cults who had access to information about Caesar's plans is mentioned. Moreover, one of the papyri found in Alexandria speaks of a woman who organized meetings between representatives of trading guilds and military clans, precisely the forces for whom it was profitable to remove Caesar. Why doesn't Livia's name appear in official sources? Because history always belongs to the victors, and a woman, especially such an influential one, could have become too dangerous a symbol. A woman could very well have been part of the conspiracy against Caesar. And Livia Drusilla is no random name. Perhaps he acted as a coordinator, a link between various interest groups, perhaps even more Octavian's advisor, who helped him use the events of March 44 BC to his advantage. History remains silent about female conspirators, but that doesn't mean they didn't exist. Could Caesar have known about the planned murder? And if so, why didn't he take steps to prevent it? Julius Caesar was not just a military genius or charismatic leader. He was one of the most cautious and foresighted politicians of his time. He had a network of spies, informants, and personal guards. He knew about every conspiracy, even the slightest hint of betrayal. But here's what's interesting. A few days before Caesar's murder, his bodyguards were suddenly recalled, supposedly by his own order. He also refused additional protection on the day of the Senate session, despite having received warnings from friends and enemies alike. There are testimonies indicating that the night before the murder, Caesar uttered a phrase that still causes disputes among historians: better to die once than constantly await death. This could be a metaphor, or it could be a direct indication that he was aware of the risks and even ready for his end. Why didn't he try to escape? Why didn't he give orders to arrest the conspirators? Perhaps because he understood his death would be the beginning of something greater. Perhaps he wanted to test who was truly by his side. Or perhaps he played his own role in this drama. Caesar could have known about the planned assassination. More than that, there are grounds to believe that he not only knew, he allowed it to happen. Perhaps he saw it as a path to eternal glory, to the image of a martyr that would strengthen his memory for centuries. Perhaps he hoped that his death would destroy the old order and open the way for a new leader, Octavian. And if that is the case, then we are dealing not with a murder, but with a sacrifice. Could Octavian have been not just an heir, but the direct organizer of Caesar's murder? Young Octavian was not in Rome at the time of Caesar's murder, but in Apollonia, a city in Macedonia, where he was preparing for military service. That is what official history says. But what if this was just a cover? What if it was from there, from afar, that he coordinated key stages of the conspiracy? It is known that immediately after Caesar's death, the young Octavian not only claimed the right to inheritance, but also began acting with astonishing confidence for a 17-year-old youth. He gathered support from the legions, negotiated with Mark Antony, purged the Senate all within a matter of months. But the most surprising thing, his first step was the elimination of witnesses. Many of those who could know the truth about the events of March 44 BC disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. Some sources even mention that Octavian personally controlled access to state archives and could destroy or alter documents related to his uncle's murder. In addition, there is an interesting detail. One of Caesar's most loyal lieutenants, Gaius Sosius, suddenly changed sides a month before the murder. Later, he would be appointed commander of the fleet under Octavian. Is this a coincidence, or part of a carefully planned scheme? Octavian acted too confidently, too quickly, too cold-bloodedly for someone who supposedly was shocked by Caesar's death. His actions after the crime suggest that he either knew about it in advance or was directly involved, perhaps as an organizer, perhaps as a shadow coordinator of all actions. Caesar fell, but his successor was already waiting for his hour.